Magnus Ashcroft didn't knock. He rode onto Rowan Hale's property at first light with 4 men behind him, dismounted without invitation, and walked straight to the well Rowan had spent 3 days digging. He looked down into it. Then he looked at Rowan. "Fill it back in," Magnus said. "This land isn't yours to develop. It never should have been sold." Rowan stood with the shovel still in his hand, dirt on his boots, sweat drying on his neck. "I have the deed." Magnus pulled a folded document from his coat and let it drop into the mud between them. "Deeds can be disputed. Men can be persuaded to leave." He turned back to his horse. "You've got until the end of the month." He rode away without looking back. His men followed. Not one of them had spoken a single word. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a man who had nothing left to lose, then you already know this story doesn't end quietly. Stay with us until the very last scene because this one will surprise you. If you're watching from another city or country, drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. The next story is already waiting. The auction lasted 11 minutes. Rowan Hale counted them on the courthouse clock across the street because he had nothing else to do with his hands except keep them still. He'd learned that a long time ago. That stillness was sometimes the only thing a man could actually control when everything else was moving too fast around him. There were 9 people at the auction. 5 of them had come out of curiosity. 2 were land speculators from Durango who'd driven down specifically to laugh at whatever poor fool had put this parcel up for bid. 1 was the county clerk, who was required by law to be there, and 1 was Rowan. He was the only one who bid. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Farrell, who'd been doing this job for 22 years and had seen stranger things than a broke cowboy buying worthless acreage, read the legal description twice because he suspected he'd misheard the first time. 240 acres, Red Mesa Valley, well-documented failure rate. Previous 4 owners, 1 bankrupted, 1 dead of fever, 1 simply vanished, and 1 who'd sold for a loss and moved his family to Colorado with what he called a second chance at dignity. "Sold," Farrell said finally, because there was nothing else to say. Rowan signed the papers with a pen that leaked ink on his first 2 fingers. He didn't notice until he was outside. He stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at the main street of Harlan, at the general store and the livery and the saloon that opened at 9 in the morning, because there was enough demand to justify it. A woman walking past with a basket of flour gave him a look, not unkind, just puzzled, the way you'd look at a man who'd just done something you couldn't quite categorize. He nodded at her. She kept walking. He had $14 left. Not $1,400, 14. He'd saved for 6 years working other men's ranches, living on bunkhouse food and mended boots, sending nothing home because there was no home to send to. 6 years of wages, careful and unspent. And now it was gone. And he had 240 acres of cursed land and $14 and a horse named Duff, who was 13 years old and had opinions about mud. He walked back to where Duff was tied, untied him, and said, "We own land now." Duff swished his tail. "I know," Rowan said. "I thought so too." He rode out to the ranch that afternoon. The road to Red Mesa Valley cut west from Harlan for about 6 miles before it stopped being a road and became more of a suggestion. 2 ruts worn into dry ground by wagons that hadn't come this way in years. Duff picked his way through it without complaint. The horse knew bad terrain. So did Rowan. The first thing he saw was the fence, or rather, what used to be a fence. The posts were still in the ground at irregular intervals, but the wire between them had long since snapped or rusted through or been pulled down by weather and neglect, and now it lay in coils and tangles across the ground, like something that had given up. The gate post stood alone at the entrance with no gate attached to it. Rowan stopped Duff there and sat for a moment, looking at the property he now owned. The house was standing. That was something. It was a 1-room structure with a covered porch that listed slightly to the left, and one of the shutters was hanging by a single hinge. But the walls were solid and the roof looked to have held through the last several winters without collapsing. The barn behind it was in worse shape. The big double doors had been torn off at some point, probably by wind, and one of the side walls had bowed outward enough that it looked like it was exhaling. The well was dry. He'd known that. It was mentioned in the auction documents, sandwiched between the acreage description and the legal disclaimers like an afterthought, as if a dry well on a cattle ranch was a minor inconvenience rather than a death sentence for any livestock operation. The pasture land to the south was cracked and pale. the grass beaten down to nothing by years of drought and zero management. The pasture to the north was in slightly better shape. There was still some ground cover, some stalks of something that might be recoverable, but slightly better than nothing was still not much. Rowan sat on Duff and looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. Then he got down, tied Duff to the gatepost, and started walking the fence line. He walked the entire perimeter over the next 2 hours, stopping every few yards to look at the posts, test the ground, crouch down, and examine the soil with his fingers. He'd worked enough ranches to know what soil exhaustion looked like and what it didn't, and this land wasn't fully dead. It was neglected, which was different. Neglect could be reversed. Death couldn't. He was on the east boundary when he heard the horse. It wasn't a working horse sound, Gits, not the plodding rhythm of a ranch animal doing a job. This was something lighter, faster, more deliberate. Rowan straightened up and turned to look. She came over the ridge at a canter, riding a gray mare that moved like she'd been bred for nothing but speed, and she knew it. The rider sat easy in the saddle, the way people do when they've been on horses since before they could walk properly. Not rigid, not performing, just part of the animal's motion, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She wore riding clothes that had seen real use, not the kind of outfit a wealthy person wore to look like they rode. She actually rode. She pulled up about 30 feet from him and looked at him without speaking for a moment. "You're the one who bought this place," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Rowan said. "Why?" He considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. Because nobody else would. She looked out over the land. Her expression was hard to read. Not dismissive, not impressed. Somewhere in between, like she was adding something up in her head. "My name is Celeste Ashcroft." He'd heard the name. Everyone in the territory had heard the name. Magnus Ashcroft ran the largest cattle operation in the region, 1,500 acres, 300 head at last count, 2 full-time foremen, and a dozen hands year-round. The Ashcroft name was in the county records going back 30 years. It was the kind of name that meant things. "Rowan Hale," he said. "I know." She looked back at him. "You should know that my father tried to buy this land twice. The owners wouldn't sell to him. Now it's sold and he's not happy about it." "I noticed," Rowan said. "He sent a man to the auction to watch." Something shifted in her expression. "He told you that?" "Nobody had to tell me. Man stood in the back and didn't bid and rode off the minute the gavel came down. That's either a man who was never going to buy anything or a man who wanted to see who did." Celeste was quiet for a moment. "You're more observant than you look." "Most people are." She almost smiled. She stopped it before it fully formed. "I came to tell you something that my father probably won't say himself. This land has underground water. Not where the well is, Tia. That well was dug wrong, 20 feet north of where it should have been. The water table runs along the east side, right about where you're standing. If you dig in the right place, you'll hit it." Rowan looked down at the ground under his boots. He looked back up at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's a waste for good land to fail due to ignorance," she said. She said it plainly, without cruelty. "I've watched this valley get worse every year because people either gave up too fast or didn't know what they were working with. I'm tired of watching it." She turned the gray mare and started back the way she'd come. "Miss Ashcroft," he called after her. She stopped but didn't turn all the way around. "Your father's going to know you told me." "My father knows a lot of things," she said. "That's different from stopping them." She clicked to the mare and rode back over the ridge. Rowan stood there for another minute, looking at the ground under his feet. Then he went back to Duff, got his bedroll out of the saddlebag, and started figuring out where he was going to sleep. He spent the first night on the porch with his back against the wall and his hat over his face, listening to the sounds the valley made when it settled in for darkness. The wind moving through the dry grass, something small rustling in the barn, the distant rhythm of Duff moving around on his picket line. He didn't sleep much. He rarely did the first night in a new place. His mind had a habit of running the numbers. What needed doing first, what could wait, where the money was going to come from. And it ran them all night without arriving at any answer that was comfortable. In the morning, he had coffee from a tin he'd packed in his saddlebag, sitting on the porch step while the sun came up over the east ridge. The light hit the valley differently than he'd expected. It came in low and warm and made the broken fence posts throw long shadows. And for a moment, just a moment, he could see what this place might look like when it was working. Then he went to get a shovel. The general store in Harlan was run by a man named Craddock, who had a handshake and a memory for debt. Rowan had done business with him before, when he'd worked the Pemberton Ranch 2 years ago, and Craddock had struck him as a fair man, if not a generous one. He rode in and tied Duff at the post and went inside and started gathering what he needed. A new shovel, rope, wire for the fence, a sack of flour, coffee, salt pork. "Here you bought the Kellerman place," Craddock said from behind the counter. "Did." Rowan set the supplies down. Craddock looked at the pile. He looked at Rowan. "You know what happened to Kellerman?" "Went broke and sold." "Before that?" "Well, before that, he didn't know what he was doing," Rowan said. "That's what happened to most of them." Craddock was quiet for a moment. He started adding up the supplies. "I'll put you on account," he said finally. "You can settle when you get moving." "I'd rather pay cash." "You've got $14. Rowan stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Small town," Craddock said, without any more explanation than that. Rowan paid cash. He had $7 left when he walked out. He rode back to the ranch and started digging 20 feet east of the old well. The ground was hard the first 3 feet, packed caliche that turned his arms to concrete by noon. But below that it softened, and by the middle of the afternoon he was deep enough that the walls of the hole had gone from pale gray to darker, damper earth. He kept digging. At 6 feet he hit mud. He stood in the hole with mud on his knees and his hat pushed back on his head and looked down at the water seeping in around his boots. He'd dug a lot of wells. He'd helped with them, anyway, on ranches where the water situation was better than this. He'd never been the one who found it. He climbed out and sat on the edge of the hole with his legs hanging down and looked at the water rising slowly below him, and he thought about the woman on the gray mare who'd told him where to dig. He should have been suspicious. He was a little suspicious. It was a strange thing, riding onto a stranger's property, to give away information that gave him an advantage her father clearly didn't want him to have. It didn't make sense in a simple way. In a complicated way, it made a certain kind of sense that he'd think about later when he had more time. For now, he had water. The next morning, he was restringing fence wire along the north property line when he heard a horse and looked up to see Celeste Ashcroft riding down the slope toward him. She was moving at a walk this time, no urgency, like she had a specific destination and was comfortable taking her time getting there. She stopped at the fence line and looked at the work he'd done. 20 feet of new wire, tight and even, the posts re-driven to sit straight again. "You found it," she said. "Came in at 6 feet, he said. "Quality's good." She nodded once, like information had been confirmed. "The north pasture's workable," she said. "You'll need to turn it. The top layer's too compacted for anything to get through, but there's decent soil underneath. My father's men found that out when they tried to graze here a few years back. They gave up too fast." Rowan coiled the wire spool and set it down. "Why did your father want this land so badly?" "He doesn't believe in land he can't own," she said. "It bothers him, like an itch. And you?" She looked at the pasture. "I think some things are worth more when they belong to someone who actually wants them." She paused. "He doesn't know I came back." "I figured that." "He's going to find out." "I figured that too." She looked at him steadily. "And you're not going to tell me not to come?" Rowan picked up the wire spool. "It's a public road." "It's your land." "The road's not," he said. He moved to the next post and went back to work. She stayed for another 2 hours. She didn't offer to help, and he didn't ask her to. She rode the fence line while he worked, pointing out occasionally where a post had been set at the wrong angle or where the ground had shifted enough to make re-driving it worth the effort. She knew this land better than he did. That was obvious. Whether she'd admit it out loud was a different question. When she left, she rode out at the same easy walk she'd come in on. No goodbye, just turned and went. Rowan watched her go, then turned back to the fence. 3 days later, Magnus Ashcroft came himself. Rowan heard him coming from a distance. Several horses, moving fast enough that the hoofbeats had a weight to them. I was stacking salvaged lumber behind the barn when they came through the gate, and he set down the boards and turned to face them without rushing. Magnus Ashcroft was bigger than Rowan had expected. He'd seen the man in town once or twice. Ashcroft was the kind of man you noticed without trying to. But on horseback with purpose behind him, he seemed to take up more space than a man reasonably should. He had a gray-streaked beard, well-kept, and eyes that were used to having people look away from them. He pulled up his horse and looked down at Rowan with an expression that wasn't anger exactly, but was several things that all pointed in the same direction. "Hail," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft," Rowan said. "I'm going to say what I came to say and then I'm going to leave, and if you're smart, you'll hear it all the way through before you answer." Ashcroft looked around the property, at the new fence wire, at the hole near the east boundary where the well casing was going in, at the lumber stacked behind the barn. Something moved across his face that might have been surprise before he put it away. "My daughter has been visiting this property. She rides this road sometimes." "Don't do that," Ashcroft said. "Don't insult my intelligence by making it smaller than it is. She's been here. She's talked to you. She may have told you things about this land that are mine to know and not yours." Rowan kept his face even. "She told me where the water was." Ashcroft's jaw tightened. "That information—" "Save this ranch," Rowan said. "I'd have found it eventually. Might have taken longer. The outcome would have been the same." The two men looked at each other. The 4 riders Ashcroft had brought stayed back and stayed quiet. They were there to make a point, not participate. "My daughter is 23 years old," Ashcroft said. "She has grown up on land and horses, and she understands the territory better than most men twice her age. She also has a talent for making decisions without thinking about what they cost." "Sounds like someone else I'm looking at," Rowan said. For a moment, just a moment, something dangerous passed through Ashcroft's eyes. Then it settled. "You want me to respect that," he said. "The nerve of a poor man." "Not poor," Rowan said. "I own 240 acres. You own debt with a deed attached to it. Deed's real." Ashcroft looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the fence line. Then he looked back. "Stay away from my daughter, Hale. Not as a request. As a statement of how things are going to be from here on." "I'll be here," Rowan said. "If she rides by, she rides by." Ashcroft wheeled his horse and left. His men followed. None of them looked back. Rowan stood in the yard after they were gone, his hands loose at his sides, breathing steadily. His heart was moving faster than he wanted it to. Not from fear. He didn't think it was fear. Something closer to the feeling of a door swinging open when you weren't sure what was on the other side. He picked up the boards and went back to stacking. The next week was hard in a way that wasn't about the work. He'd known the work would be hard. He'd planned for hard work. What he hadn't planned for was everything around it. Craddock stopped extending credit without explanation. Rowan went in on a Tuesday for more wire, and Craddock looked at him with something between apology and resignation and said the account was closed, just like that. Rowan paid what he had left and left without making a scene, but he rode back to the ranch going over the numbers in his head, and they didn't add up to anything good. 2 days later, the man he'd hired to help sink the well casing, a local worker named Birch, who'd done this kind of work for years, came to the property and told Rowan he couldn't take the job. He said it without meeting Rowan's eyes. He said he was sorry. He didn't say why, and Rowan didn't push him because there was no point pushing a man who'd clearly already been pushed from another direction. He sank the casing himself. It took 4 days instead of 1, and he pulled a muscle in his left shoulder on the 3rd day that made lifting anything with that arm feel like someone had driven a nail into the joint. But the casing went in and the water held, and when he pumped the handle for the first time and water came out cold and clear, he sat down on the ground next to the well and stayed there for a while. He was still sitting there when he heard the gray mare. "You did the casing yourself," Celeste said, looking at the finished well. "Birch couldn't make it." She was quiet for a moment. "I know why he couldn't. Your father. He didn't threaten anyone. He doesn't have to. He just makes it clear what associations he doesn't prefer, and people draw their own conclusions." She got down from the gray mare and stood at the edge of the well and looked into it. "He doesn't understand that this makes it worse." "Makes what worse?" She looked at him. "Whatever he's afraid of." "What is he afraid of?" She didn't answer right away. She reached out and worked the pump handle twice, and water came up. She watched it fall. "He's afraid you're going to prove something," she said finally. "He's afraid you're going to make this ranch work, and people are going to see it, and they're going to wonder why it never worked for the men before you." "Why didn't it?" "Because he made sure it didn't." The words sat there between them. Rowan looked at her. She was looking at the water still dripping from the pump spout, her jaw set, her eyes steady. She'd just said something that cost her something to say. "He drove them out," Rowan said. He didn't drive anyone out. He just made it harder than they could handle, restricted their supply access, spread word that the land was cursed, which wasn't hard because the land already had a reputation. She paused. He wants this valley consolidated. All of it. Every parcel running under one operation. His operation. Yes. Rowan was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass in the south pasture. Duff made a sound from where he was picketed near the barn. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked her the first day, but it meant something different now. She turned to look at him directly. "Because I grew up watching my father believe that the right amount of pressure on the right person makes problems go away, and I'm tired of watching it work." She remounted the gray mare and straightened in the saddle. "The south pasture needs turning before it'll support anything. You'll need a plow rig. I can get you access to one at the Hendricks place. They'll lend it for a share of the first season's yield. Hendricks owes my father money and knows it, so he'll be discreet." "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about this valley for a long time," she said. "I just hadn't found the right reason to do something about it." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that cost something. "Don't tell my father I was here. He'll find out." "He always does," she said. "I'm buying time." She turned the mare and rode out through the open gate. Rowan stood at the well and listened to the hoofbeats fade until they were gone and the valley was quiet again. Then he went to find a shovel. He had a plow rig to arrange, a shoulder that needed to stop hurting enough to let him use it, and probably about 3 more weeks before Magnus Ashcroft decided that cutting off credit and pulling workers wasn't enough, and came back with something that required a more direct answer. But that was 3 weeks away. Right now, he had water and fence line and a south pasture waiting to be turned. He put the shovel on his shoulder and headed out to look at the soil. The south pasture turned harder than Rowan expected. Not harder than he could handle. He'd worked clay soil before, worked it in rain and in heat and in the kind of cold that made the ground feel like iron, but harder than the Hendricks plow rig wanted to deal with. The rig was old, the blade worn down from years of use and not enough sharpening, and twice in the first morning it caught on something buried in the soil and jerked the handle so hard it nearly took Rowan's bad shoulder with it. He stopped the third time it happened and stood there with his hand on the horse's flank and his shoulder singing and looked at the 6 rows he'd turned so far against the 60 he still needed. The morning was already hot. His shirt was soaked through. The borrowed horse pulling the rig, a big roan gelding from the Hendricks place that had opinions about everything, kept trying to angle left toward the fence line. "Straight," Rowan told him. The roan swished his tail. "I know," Rowan said. "Me too." He adjusted his grip, put his weight into it, and kept going. By the end of the 3rd day, he had the south pasture fully turned. His shoulder was a problem that he was going to have to deal with later, meaning he was going to ignore it until it either got better or got worse enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. He returned the Hendricks rig on the 4th morning, and the old rancher met him at the gate, a quiet man named Silas Hendricks, with a face that had been weathered past the point of showing much, and looked at the rig, and then at Rowan, and then at the rig again. "You didn't break it," Hendricks said, sounding mildly surprised. "Blade needs sharpening." "Everything needs something." Hendricks squinted out at the road. "You know Ashcroft came by here." Rowan kept his expression even. "What did he want?" "Wanted to know if I'd lent you the rig." Hendricks paused. "I told him I didn't recall." Rowan looked at him. Hendricks was still looking at the road. "I appreciate that," Rowan said. "I don't owe him my memory," Hendricks said. "I owe him $400 from a bad winter 3 years back. That's a different thing." He looked at Rowan then, straight on. "Don't make me regret the distinction." Rowan rode back to the ranch and thought about that for a while. Celeste came the next morning. She didn't announce herself, she never did, just appeared on the gray mare at the south fence line and looked at the turned pasture and said, "That's better than I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected you to get through about half of it before the rig gave out." She rode along the fence, looking at the rows. "The soil's decent underneath. You'll need seed. Ryegrass would establish fastest. There's a seed merchant in Colville, not Harlan." "Not Harlan because Craddock." "Not Harlan because everyone who owes my father something is in Harlan," she said. "Colville's different. The merchants there don't have reason to care what Magnus Ashcroft prefers." "How far is Colville?" 14 miles east, half a day's ride. She stopped the mare and looked at him. I can draw you a list of what to ask for and what a fair price looks like. The Colville merchants know good grass seed from cheap filler. If they think you don't know the difference, they'll sell you cheap filler. Will they think I don't know the difference? She considered him with the kind of look that was assessment without apology. Probably yes at first. Then write the list. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. He rode up and took it. She'd already written it. He looked down at the paper. It was detailed. Seed varieties, quantities, approximate prices, a note about what the merchant would try to substitute and why the substitution wouldn't work in Red Mesa Valley's specific soil composition. It was the kind of information that took years to know. You wrote this before you came, he said. I wrote it last night, she said, after I checked what stage the pasture should be in by now. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. Why did you check? She looked at the turned rows for a moment. Something passed across her face that she didn't name. Because I wanted to know if you were keeping up, she said finally. And? You're keeping up. She turned the mare. Colville. Ask for Reeves at the grain house, not whoever's at the front counter. Reeves will give you the right price. She rode out before he could say anything else. He made the Colville ride 2 days later, took the list, found Reeves, and came back with enough rye grass seed to establish the south pasture and a portion of the north. The whole transaction had taken less than an hour. He didn't know how to feel about how efficiently Celeste had solved a problem he hadn't finished figuring out yet. He was spreading seed on the south pasture, slow, methodical work, the kind that asked nothing of your thinking, when he heard riders on the main road. Not coming to the gate, just passing. But they slowed as they went by, and Rowan looked up and recognized 2 of the men as riders from the Ashcroft operation. They looked at the turned pasture, looked at the new well casing, looked at the fence line, and rode on without stopping. He went back to spreading seed. That evening, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and added things up in his head. Ashcroft had cut his supply access. Ashcroft had pulled the workers. Ashcroft was watching. None of that had stopped anything, which meant Ashcroft was either running out of easy moves or building towards something harder. Neither option was comfortable. He went to bed thinking about it and woke up at first light thinking about it and spent most of the morning's fence work thinking about it, which was probably why he didn't hear Celeste arrive until she was already through the gate. She wasn't alone. The man riding beside her was older, maybe 50, with a practical look about him. The kind of man who fixed things for a living and had the hands to show it. He sat a horse the way working men did, comfortable and unromantic about it. This is Walt Emery, Celeste said. He's a driller, not from Harlan. He works the eastern ranches, and he owes me a favor. Rowan looked at Walt Emery. What kind of favor? The kind I'm not going to explain, Celeste said, and her tone made it clear that was the end of that. Walt thinks there may be a second water source on the property, deeper than the first. If there is, it would be enough to support serious cattle capacity. Walt Emery had already gotten off his horse and was crouching down near the fence line, looking at the ground with an expression that was complete and undivided. He moved along the fence slowly, still crouched, doing something with his hands that Rowan couldn't quite follow. He's reading the ground, Rowan said quietly. He's reading what the ground did a long time ago, Celeste said, where water moved through it, old channels, dry ones. Does that work? About half the time, she said. Better odds than guessing. Rowan watched Walt Emery work his way along the east boundary, slow and careful, crouching and rising and crouching again. Your father know you're here? No. He's been sending riders past the property. She didn't look surprised. I know. He's doing it to make you aware he's watching. It's a pressure tactic. I figured. Has it worked? On the pressure? No. He paused. On the awareness? Yes. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means I know something is coming, he said. I just don't know what shape it's in yet. She was quiet for a moment. Emery had moved to a spot about 40 yards north of the existing well and stopped, standing still, looking at the ground with a stillness that seemed out of proportion for a man just looking at dirt. There, Emery said. He didn't raise his voice. He said it the way you'd say something that had already been established. Under here, maybe 30, 35 feet. It's not as strong as the eastern source, but it runs parallel. If you case it right, you'd have redundancy. If one drops in drought, the other may hold. Rowan walked over and looked at the ground. It looked like the same ground as everywhere else. You're sure? 90%, Emery said. I've been wrong before. Usually on properties where the geology's been disturbed by blasting. This land hasn't been blasted, so 90%. That's good enough for me, Rowan said. Emery stood and dusted his knees off. I can come back Thursday to help you sink the casing. I've got materials in my wagon I can leave with you. He looked at Celeste. We're square? We're square, she said. Emery mounted and rode out without ceremony. Rowan watched him go, then looked at Celeste. What did he owe you? Walt's daughter was in a situation 2 years ago that needed someone with my last name to make a phone call, Celeste said. I made it. Rowan considered that, the brevity of it, the weight packed inside the brevity. That's a lot to carry around as a debt. I don't think of it as a debt, she said. I think of it as having done something useful. She looked at the spot Emery had identified. You should mark that. You don't want to lose the location. He went to find a stake. She stayed that day longer than she had before. Not by design, he didn't think. There was no announcement of it, no shift in her manner. She just kept finding things that needed commentary. The north fence had a section where the posts were set too shallow and would give in a hard wind. The barn wall that had bowed outward could be braced from inside without full reconstruction if you placed the bracing at the right angle. The ryegrass he'd seeded would need a second spread on the eastern edge of the south pasture where the soil was thinner. She delivered all of this walking or on foot while he worked, matter-of-fact, specific, never veering into opinion about things that weren't structural. She didn't offer to pick up tools. He didn't ask her to. The arrangement had settled into something without either of them naming it. At mid-afternoon, she stopped near the barn and said, "You're not going to thank me, are you?" It wasn't quite a question. He looked up from the brace he was fitting. "I thanked you for the well." "Once." "Was once not enough?" She looked at him with an expression that was harder to parse than her usual ones. Not irritated, not amused, something more like genuine uncertainty. "Most people thank me more than once, usually because they want something else." "I thanked you for the well because you saved the well," he said. "Everything else you've told me is information. I'd have found most of it eventually." "Not the driller." "No," he said. "Not the driller." He fit the brace in place and held it. "That one I'm grateful for. Just grateful, not thankful." "There's a difference?" "There's always a difference," she said, and then she went back to looking at the bowed wall and didn't push it further. She left before dark. He watched her go and then went inside and cooked salt pork and ate it without tasting it, thinking about the difference between grateful and thankful and coming up with nothing useful. 3 days later, Magnus Ashcroft came back. This time he came alone. No riders. Just him, riding a big black gelding at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate, and he came through the gate without stopping and rode up to where Rowan was working the north fence. He looked at the fence. He looked at the turned south pasture. He looked at the second well stake. His expression was not the controlled fury of the first visit. It was something colder and more specific. He got down from the black gelding and stood with the reins in his hand and said, "You've had help." "I've done most of it myself," Rowan said. "Don't." Ashcroft's voice was flat. "The second water site, the ryegrass, the specific type of brace on the barn wall." He looked at Rowan with eyes that had arrived at a conclusion. "My daughter has been here more than once." Rowan didn't deny it. There was no point. "I told you to stay away from her," Ashcroft said. "You told me not to approach her. I haven't." He set down the fence pliers. "She rides where she wants to ride. I can't stop a woman from crossing her own family's boundary road." "You could have told her to go." "I could have." The silence between them was specific and deliberate. "She's not a ranch hand," Ashcroft said. "She's not something you use to get ahead." Rowan looked at him steadily. "I'm aware of what she is." "Are you?" It wasn't a question. Ashcroft looked past him at the property, at the new fence wire glinting in the late sun, at the south pasture with its young seed just beginning to take, at the well with its new casing sitting straight and solid in the ground. Something worked in his jaw. "I underestimated how far she'd take this." "What she's done is told me things about land she knows better than anyone," Rowan said. "Things that would have taken me a season to figure out on my own. She cares about this valley working. That's all I've seen." "That's not all there is." "Maybe not," Rowan said, "but it's all that's happened." Ashcroft turned back to him. The cold thing in his expression had shifted slightly. Not warmer, but different, like he was recalculating. I'm going to be direct with you, Hale. I've been operating on the assumption that you'd fail here the same way the others did. I arranged for that to be more likely. He paused. You haven't failed. No. You've also had assistance that wasn't available to the others. Yes. Ashcroft looked at the ground between them. His jaw worked once more. What do you want with this ranch? Rowan picked up the fence pliers again. To run cattle, build it to 300 head by year 3. Have something to leave. To leave to who? You have no family. To whoever comes after, Rowan said. I'm 31 years old. That's not a permanent condition. Something moved across Ashcroft's face, too fast to name it. He remounted the black gelding and looked down at Rowan from the saddle. Stay away from my daughter, Hale. I'm going to ask you that plainly, man to man, setting aside everything else. She makes decisions without thinking about how they look. It's a liability she doesn't understand she has. She strikes me as someone who thinks very carefully about what she decides, Rowan said. About the land, Ashcroft said. About horses and soil and water. Yes, about other things. He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he chose not to finish it. The end of the month, he said. I want to see what you've done with this place by the end of the month. If you're serious, that'll show it. He pulled the gelding around. And if you've got any sense at all, you'll understand what I'm telling you about Celeste. He rode out. Rowan stood at the fence with the pliers in his hand and watched the black gelding disappear through the gate and felt the ground under this whole situation shift slightly in a way he couldn't yet measure. The end of the month was 16 days away. He went back to work. The days that followed had a rhythm that was brutal in the most honest way. Up before light, work until the light was gone, eat whatever came to hand, sleep like a man who'd earned it. The shoulder got better, and then worse, and then better again. The south pasture began showing green, faint and tentative, but there. The second well went in on Thursday with Emery's help, and it came in at 31 feet and ran cleaner than the first, which was not something Rowan had expected. Good land, Emery said, capping the casing and standing back to look at it. Someone spent a long time not knowing what they had. Rowan looked at the two wells, one east and one north, both working, both clean. That seems to be the pattern out here. Emery gathered his tools without any further comment on the subject and rode out. The rumor reached Rowan through a man named Ferris, who sometimes worked the road between Harlan and Red Mesa Valley doing fence repair for various properties. Ferris was the kind of man who moved between things and therefore knew what things were doing, and he stopped at Rowan's gate on a Tuesday morning with the look of a person who wasn't sure whether he was doing a favor or causing trouble. Heard something in Harlan yesterday, Ferris said. At the saloon. Rowan waited. Word's going around that the county assessor's going to revisit the Red Mesa parcel valuation. Ferris said it carefully, the way you said something you weren't sure you understood. On account of some question about the original survey boundaries. Rowan went still. What question? Don't know exactly. Something about the eastern boundary possibly crossing onto land that was part of an old Ashcroft claim before the territory was reorganized. If that holds up, the deed could be disputed, Rowan said. That's what I heard. Rowan looked at the gatepost. His gatepost. On his land. When did this start? Couldn't say. But the assessor's got a meeting scheduled for Friday. Ferris looked uncomfortable, like the discomfort was something he'd absorbed from the information itself. Thought you should know, since you're here and all. After Ferris rode on, Rowan stood at the gate for a long time. Then he went inside and got out the deed and spread it on the table and read every line of it, including the lines he'd already read 3 times, including the property description and the survey references and the chain of title going back to the original territorial claim. He read it twice more. Then he sat back and thought about Magnus Ashcroft, who had told him he'd underestimated him, who had come back alone to look at the progress, who had set an end-of-month deadline and then, 12 days before it arrived, had apparently moved to a different kind of pressure entirely. The door was shut against the evening wind. The deed was on the table. Outside, both wells were running, the south pasture was green and young, the fence was straight. He needed a lawyer. The only lawyer in Harlan was a man named Good, who did mostly estate work and the occasional contract dispute, and Rowan had seen him twice from a distance. a thin man with a careful walk. He rode to Harlan the next morning and went to Good's office above the dry goods store and knocked. Good opened the door and looked at him and said, "Hail. You know who I am?" "Harlan's a small town," Good said, not unpleasantly. "Come in." Rowan sat down and put the deed on the desk and explained what Ferris had told him. Good listened without interrupting, which Rowan respected. When Rowan finished, Good picked up the deed and read it for a while. "The eastern boundary question," Good said. "It's not nothing. There was an old Ashcroft claim that ran through this valley before the territorial reorganization in 1887. When the territory was reorganized, some parcels were redrawn. If Magnus Ashcroft can demonstrate that the original survey for your parcel didn't account for the 1887 adjustment, he could potentially argue the eastern 40 acres are improperly deeded. Could he win that argument? Good was quiet for a moment. He set the deed down. It would depend on the original surveyor's notes and whether the territorial reorganization records support the adjustment. Those records exist, but they're in the county seat, not Harlan. He looked at Rowan. If you had those records, and they supported your deed, the argument would fail before it started. And if I don't have them? Then you're defending against a claim that might have some technical merit, Good said, which is expensive and slow even if you ultimately win. Which is the point, Rowan said. Good met his eyes. He didn't say anything, which was enough. Rowan rode back to the ranch. He did not ride out to get the records that day because it was late and the county seat was a full day's ride. He fed Duff and checked the wells and walked the fence and thought. He was on the porch that evening when he saw a single rider coming down the road at a pace too fast for the hour and the light. He knew the gray mare by now. He stood up. Celeste came through the gate and pulled up short of the porch, and she didn't get down. She was breathing faster than the ride should have required, and there was something in her face that was tightly controlled in the way you controlled something you were angry about. He filed the boundary claim, she said. Today, not Friday. He moved it up. Rowan felt something cold and specific settle in his chest. I know. You know? Ferris told me yesterday. I talked to Good this morning. He looked up at her. The records I need are at the county seat. The 1887 reorganization survey. Her voice was flat. I know which records they are. She was quiet for a moment. Something worked behind her eyes. He filed today because he knew you'd found out. He's trying to get ahead of it. Can he? She looked at him directly. Not if the records say what I think they say. She paused. I've seen those records. I went to the county seat with my father 2 years ago when he was trying to establish the northern boundary of the home ranch. The 1887 reorganization adjusted the valley parcels eastward, not westward. If anything, your eastern boundary is more clearly defined than most. Rowan looked at her. You've seen the records? Yes. And you know what they say? Yes. Then why did he file? She took a slow breath. It was the first thing she'd done that looked involuntary. Because he's betting you don't know what they say, and that by the time you get to the county seat and get a lawyer to interpret them, the assessor's meeting will have already happened and the uncertainty will have been enough to stall your operation through the season. She looked past him at the south pasture, at the green. He's betting on time, not law. Rowan stood on the porch in the cooling evening and looked at the woman on the gray mare who had just explained her own father's strategy to him with the precision and steadiness of someone who had been holding this in long enough that it now came out clean and controlled. I'm sorry, she said. She said it quietly, and it didn't sound like something she said very often. It's not yours to apologize for. He's my father. That doesn't make it yours. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that had something raw in it before she put it away. I can go to the county seat with you. I can show you exactly where the records are and what they say. She straightened in the saddle. And I can give a statement to Good about what I've personally reviewed in those files. My name carries weight with the county records office. I won't pretend otherwise. Rowan was quiet for a moment. You'd do that against your father. I do it for the truth, she said, which is a different thing. A pause. And because I helped build those wells, and I am not watching them get taken on a falsified claim. The last sentence came out harder than the rest, more personal. He looked at her and understood, in the way you understand something without being able to fully explain it, that this moment was costing her something real. Thursday morning, he said, Early. It's a long ride. She nodded once. I'll be at the gate before sunrise. She turned the gray mare and rode out into the darkening evening, and Rowan stood on the porch and watched her go until he couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Then he went inside and folded the deed and put it in his coat pocket, where it would stay until Thursday. He didn't sleep particularly well. Not from worry, exactly. Worry was something you did when you felt helpless, and he didn't feel helpless. He felt like a man who had located the problem and was looking at it clearly, which was different. But his mind kept moving through the same set of facts in different orders, turning them around to see what each angle revealed, and by 3 in the morning he'd turned them enough times that he gave up on sleep and sat on the porch with cold coffee and listened to the valley. The green in the south pasture was faint in the darkness, but he knew it was there. He thought about Celeste, who had told him where the water was on the first day, who had written the seed list the night before bringing it, who had arranged the driller out of a favor she'd earned and could have kept, who had just told him the truth about her father's strategy and offered her own name as a weapon against it. She was not a simple person. He'd understood that early. But he was arriving at the full shape of it slowly, the way you arrive at the full shape of something in low light. He finished the cold coffee and went in and lay down and was asleep in 10 minutes. Before sunrise, he heard the gray mare at the gate. She was there before the sky turned gray. Rowan came out with his coat on and his saddlebag packed, and Celeste was already at the gate on the gray mare, sitting straight, a canvas satchel across her shoulder that he hadn't seen before. She'd dressed practically, riding coat, good boots, nothing that announced the Ashcroft name. He wasn't sure if that was intentional. "You eat?" he said. "I'll eat when we stop." He mounted Duff and they rode out through the gate without ceremony, heading east on the road that led eventually to the county seat at Mill Haven. The morning was cold enough that their breath showed, and the valley was still in that particular pre-dawn stillness where sound carried differently. Hoofbeats sharper, the creek somewhere to the south louder than it would be in an hour. They didn't talk much in the first miles. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people with a shared destination and a shared problem, which was a different kind of quiet than two people with nothing to say. After about 4 miles, Celeste said, "He doesn't know I'm doing this." I assumed. "He'll know by tonight." "What happens then?" She was quiet for a moment. The gray mare picked her way around a rut in the road. "He'll be angry. He'll say things." She paused. "He won't disown me, if that's what you're asking. He's not built that way. But it won't be pleasant." "You don't have to do this," Rowan said. He meant it plainly, no strategy in it. She looked at him. "I know." That was all she said, and he understood she meant it the same way. They reached Mill Haven at mid-morning. The county seat was larger than Harlan, a proper town with a bank and a courthouse and a telegraph office, and enough foot traffic on the main street to feel like something was actually happening. Rowan had been here twice before, both times on other men's business. He'd never had his own. Celeste led them without hesitation to the county records office, a squat stone building behind the courthouse that had the look of something built to last, and not much else. A clerk at the front desk looked up when they came in, looked at Celeste first, then at Rowan, then back at Celeste with the particular adjustment in expression that came from recognizing a name you associated with importance. "Miss Ashcroft," the clerk said. "Mr. Dean," she said, "I need the 1887 Territorial Reorganization Survey for the Red Mesa Valley parcels. All of them, including the base index." Dean looked at Rowan again. Rowan looked back without offering anything. "Of course," Dean said, and went to find the records. They were in the back room for 40 minutes. The records were large folded documents on heavy paper, annotated in several different hands, the kind of thing that had been updated over years as information was added and corrected. Celeste spread them on the reference table with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before and started moving through them with a focus that reminded Rowan of the way she walked fence lines. Systematic, nothing skipped. "Here," she said after about 15 minutes. She put her finger on a line of text and a corresponding boundary notation on the survey map. The 1887 reorganization moved the valley parcel boundaries to account for the creek relocation. The adjustment ran eastward, which means the parcels east of the creek, including yours, were confirmed in their existing positions. She looked at him. "Your eastern boundary isn't inside any prior Ashcroft claim. It never was. The prior Ashcroft claim ran north of the creek, not south of it." Rowan looked at the notation. He could follow it mostly. The language was legal and old, but the boundary references were clear enough. So the filing is based on a misreading. The filing is based on a misreading that my father knows is a misreading, she said. Her voice was steady. He's been in this room. He's seen these documents. He knows where his claim ends. Rowan looked at her profile. She was still looking at the survey, her jaw set, her hand flat on the document. Write that down, he said. Exactly what you just told me. I'll have Good notarize a statement when we get back. She looked up at him. For a moment, something moved across her face. The full weight of what she was about to do, maybe. She'd said it calmly, but saying it on paper with her name attached was a different act. All right, she said. She wrote for 20 minutes at the reference table while Rowan had Dean pull a copy of the relevant survey section, an official certified copy that the county office stamped and signed. Dean did it without comment and with the slightly elevated efficiency of a man who understood he was in the middle of something larger than a records request. When they were done, Celeste folded her written statement and handed it to Rowan. He put it with the certified copy in his saddlebag, next to the deed. The saddlebag was getting full. They ate at a lunch counter on Millhaven's Main Street, a working counter. Nothing fancy, the kind of place that served whatever was ready without much discussion. Rowan had beans and cornbread. Celeste had the same, which he hadn't expected. What did you expect? She said. I don't know, something less practical. I grew up eating what the ranch cooks made, she said. My father builds an empire and expects to be served accordingly. I grew up in the kitchen asking questions. She ate without elaborating on that. Rowan thought about what kind of house that was. A father who commanded rooms and a daughter who went to the kitchen to learn things. He thought about what it produced, which was currently sitting across a lunch counter from him eating beans and holding the document that was going to stop her father's legal maneuver cold. What made you this way? He said. He didn't know exactly what he meant by that, but she seemed to understand it. She thought about it for a moment. My mother died when I was 9, she said. My father got bigger after that, took up more space. I think it was how he handled it, by expanding the operation, controlling more, owning more. It gave him something to put his hands on. She pushed a bit of cornbread around her plate. I went in the other direction. I wanted to understand things, know how they actually worked underneath, not control them, just understand them. She said it without asking for anything. No performance in it, no invitation for comfort. She would have been different from him, Rowan said. A guess, but a considered one. She was, Celeste said. She knew every worker on the ranch by name and what their family situations were. My father knew their job functions. She paused. He's not a cruel man. He just measures things by what they produce, not what they are. Rowan ate for a moment. Outside the lunch counter window, Millhaven went about its business. He's going to have to measure this differently, Rowan said. Yes. Will he? She looked at him. I don't know. He's never been wrong in a way that couldn't be quietly corrected before. She was quiet for a moment. This can't be quietly corrected. They rode back in the afternoon, the certified copy, and the statement in the saddlebag, and reached Red Mesa Valley by early evening. The south pasture was holding its green in the low light, stubborn and particular, the way young growth always looked when it was actually going to survive. Rowan took the records to Good's office first thing the next morning. Good read the certified copy, read Celeste's statement, and sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who had just seen a case collapse before it started. File a response to the boundary claim with these attached, Good said. I'll have it prepared by this afternoon. The assessor will see it before Friday's meeting. Will that be enough? More than enough. Good tapped Celeste's statement. A witness statement from an Ashcroft contradicting the claim, supported by certified county records. The assessor would need a very compelling reason to proceed, and I don't believe he'll find one. He looked at Rowan over the desk. You understand what this means for the relationship between the Ashcroft operation and your property? I understand. It may get worse before it stops. I know that too. Good filed the response that afternoon. Rowan rode back to the ranch and spent the rest of the day working the north fence, which still had 3 sections that weren't right, and tried not to spend too much time thinking about what Magnus Ashcroft would do when he found out. He didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, one of the Ashcroft riders, not one Rowan recognized, which meant he'd sent someone new, came to the gate and handed Rowan a sealed letter and rode away without a word. Rowan opened it standing at the gate. It was from Magnus. The handwriting was large and controlled and took up most of a single page. It said, "You have made your position clear, so has my daughter. I will not pretend this changes nothing." That was all it said. Rowan read it twice, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He stood at the gate for a moment, looking out at the road the rider had gone down. Then he went back to the fence. He was on the third section of the north fence the following afternoon when he smelled smoke. He smelled it before he saw it, a quality of smoke that was different from a cook fire or a clearing burn, thicker and mixed with something that might have been resin or hay. He straightened up and turned and saw the column rising from the direction of the Ashcroft home ranch, maybe 2 miles north. Not from his property, from theirs. He stood still for a full second, calculating. The wind was blowing south, the smoke was black and heavy and moving fast. He could see, even from this distance, that what was burning was large. He left the fence pliers on the ground and ran for Duff. He pushed Duff harder than he liked to push him on rough ground, but the old horse had more in him than his age suggested, and they covered the 2 miles in a way that left no time for careful thinking. As he crested the north ridge and came down toward the Ashcroft property, the barn was already fully involved. A wall of orange that made the air above it shimmer and pushed heat outward in a wave you felt from 50 yards. 3 of the barn's 4 sides were burning. The big double doors on the south face were open, and from inside came a sound that was specific and terrible. Horses, 4 or 5 of them, screaming in the way horses screamed when they were terrified and trapped and had no understanding of the danger, except that it was everywhere. There were 6 men in the yard. They were doing the things men did around a fire that was already beyond control, backing up, moving things away from the structure, hauling water in buckets that were going to accomplish nothing. One of them was shouting directions. None of them were going in. Rowan got off Duff and looked at the barn and looked at the men. "How many horses?" he said to the nearest man. The man looked at him, registered him as a stranger, registered something else about the question itself. 5, maybe 6. We got one out on the east side before the wall went. Which stalls are they in? The center line? Line. All of them. Rowan pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, soaked it from a bucket a man was carrying, and went in through the south doors. The inside of the barn was something he didn't have a ready reference for. Not darkness exactly, because the fire provided its own terrible light, but a chaos of light and heat and smoke that made direction unreliable. He knew barn layouts. He went left first, toward the center line, and the smoke was dense enough at 6 feet off the ground that he was moving in a crouch before he'd gone 10 steps. The first horse was a bay mare, pressed into the corner of her stall, sides heaving. He got the stall door open, and she didn't want to move. Terror had locked her down. And he grabbed her halter with both hands and pulled and talked to her in the low, even tone you used when an animal needed to hear a human voice that wasn't panicking. She came. Slowly, then in a rush, and he moved with her and got her out through the south doors and handed her off to someone's hands and went back in. The second was easier, a young gelding who came out fast the moment the stall gate opened, nearly knocking Rowan down in the process. He let the horse find its own way to the doors and went to the next stall. The third horse was down. Not dead, he could see the animal's side moving, but down on the stall floor, too frightened or too affected by smoke to stand. Rowan got into the stall and got his hands under the horse's head and put his shoulder into the animal's side and pushed, talking steady and low. And the horse scrambled and got its front legs under itself. And Rowan kept his hands on the halter and kept the pressure steady, and the horse found its feet. Above him, something in the roof shifted. He felt it more than heard it, a groan through the structure, a change in the way the heat was pressing down. He moved faster. He got the third horse out. He went back for the fourth. Somewhere in the movement between the fourth and fifth horses, he lost track of time the way you did in situations that were moving too fast for time to register normally. A section of the hayloft came down. Not on him, but close enough that the displaced air hit him like a shove, and the heat spiked to something that felt like standing inside a kiln. He was coughing and couldn't stop, and his eyes were running, and he couldn't see much, but he could hear the last horse, and he moved toward the sound. The last one was a stallion, black, big through the chest, and he'd come halfway out of his stall on his own, but something, debris, a piece of fallen timber, had him blocked. Rowan got to the timber and pulled at it with both hands, and it was heavier than it had any right to be, and his shoulder screamed and he pulled again, and it moved enough. The stallion came out like something launched from a catapult. Rowan flattened himself against the stall wall, and the horse went past him at a run, found the doors, found the air, and was gone. Rowan followed him out. He made it through the doors and went about 10 steps, and then his legs decided they'd done enough for the moment. He went down on one knee in the dirt of the yard and stayed there, coughing smoke out of his lungs in long, racking pulls that didn't feel like they were going to stop. His eyes were streaming. His shoulder was a sustained note of pain. He was still coughing when the roof of the barn collapsed inward with a sound like a controlled explosion, a rush of heat and sparks that moved everyone in the yard back another 20 feet. He was aware of people around him. Voices. Someone put a hand on his shoulder, his bad shoulder, and he flinched away without meaning to. He stayed on one knee until the coughing settled enough to let him breathe in something like a normal pattern. His lungs felt scorched. His face felt tight, and he could tell from the heat in it that there was some burning across his forehead and hands. Not deep burns, not the kind that would leave him without skin, but real. He sat back on his heels in the dirt and looked at what was left of the barn. "All of them?" he said. His voice came out wrong, rougher than normal, scraped raw. The man crouching next to him, he still didn't know who it was, said, "All of them, all 6. He nodded. He put his hand on the ground to steady himself and looked at the burning structure and thought about the black stallion going out through those doors and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anything else either. He became aware of a presence to his right that had a different weight from the others. He turned his head. Magnus Ashcroft was standing 6 feet away. He wasn't in his usual commanding posture, hat straight, bearing deliberate. He was standing the way a man stood when something had knocked the structure out of him temporarily. His coat was off. His shirt had a scorch mark on the left sleeve. He'd been close to the fire when it started. His eyes were on Rowan with an expression that had no category Rowan had a ready name for. They looked at each other for a moment without either of them speaking. Then Magnus looked at the collapsed barn, then back at Rowan. "How many did you get out?" Magnus said. His voice was different. Something that was usually armored in it was not armored right now. "6, Rowan said. "1 was already out when I got there." "5 then." "5. Magnus was quiet for a long moment. His jaw worked once. He looked at his hands, which were also marked from being near the fire. He looked back at the wreckage. "The stallion," he said. "He's the one that wouldn't come easy. He was blocked by timber." "He's worth $300, Magnus said. Then he stopped, like he'd heard how that sounded and didn't know what to do with it. I'm not saying that's..." He stopped again, ran a hand across his face. "You could have left them." Rowan said nothing. "Nobody would have blamed you, not after what's been between us." Magnus looked at him directly. "Why didn't you?" Rowan looked at the smoldering wreckage. His lungs still didn't feel right. "They were alive and scared, and nobody else was going in," he said. "Didn't need more reason than that." Magnus made a sound that wasn't a word, something that was trying to be composed and wasn't quite getting there. "The boundary filing," Magnus said abruptly. "Yes." "I got Good's response yesterday." "Yes." Magnus looked away. Out at the far pasture where several of the rescued horses were being caught and calmed by his men. His black stallion was at the fence line, sides still heaving but standing, and one of the hands was running a hand down the animal's neck in slow strokes. "The records say what your lawyer said they say. I knew that when I filed." He said it plainly, with no decoration. "It was a delay tactic." "I know," Rowan said. Magnus turned back to him. His expression was doing something complicated. "Celeste. Left her out of it," Rowan said. "She put herself in it. She told me what was true, that's all." Magnus looked at him for a long time. The fire was still burning in the center of the collapsed structure, but lower now, no longer urgent. The sounds of the yard had settled from crisis to the slow, organized movements of aftermath. "You need someone to look at your hands," Magnus said finally. "I'm fine." "You have burns on your face, too." "I know what I have." Magnus's expression tightened slightly. Not anger, something more like a man accustomed to having the last word on things, encountering the specific resistance of a person who had a different relationship with the last word. He turned and said something to one of his men that Rowan didn't catch. A woman appeared, the ranch's cook or housekeeper. He wasn't sure. With a cloth and a tin of salve, and she looked at Rowan with the efficient sympathy of someone who'd treated injuries before and didn't have time for ceremony. He let her do what she was going to do because arguing with it was more effort than accepting it. She worked on his hands and the side of his face with a practice that was almost impersonal, which he found easier than tenderness would have been. Celeste arrived while the woman was still working. He heard the gray mare and looked up, and she came through the gate at a canter and pulled up when she saw the collapsed barn and the yard still smelling of char. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at the men, then found Rowan and got down from the mare and walked to him quickly. She stopped in front of him and looked at his hands, at the burn along his forehead, at whatever expression was on his face. "All of them?" she said. "All of them." She closed her eyes for a single second, then opened them. "You went in." "Someone had to." She looked at him with something that was not the controlled assessment he was used to from her, something that had a different texture. She didn't say what she was thinking, but she didn't look away from him either. Magnus was watching them. Rowan was aware of it without looking at him directly. The cook finished with the salve and moved away. Celeste stayed where she was, closer than she usually stood. "How did the fire start?" Rowan asked. He directed it at Magnus. Magnus looked at the wreckage. "Lightning struck the north corner," he said. "About 2 hours after dark. The hay in the loft caught before anyone got out here." He paused. "We had a hand who was supposed to be doing evening rounds. He was in the bunkhouse." His voice had gone flat on that last sentence. "Not set," Rowan said. "No, not set." Magnus said it like he'd considered the question himself. "Just bad luck and one man who wasn't where he was supposed to be." He looked at Rowan again with that expression that still didn't have a proper category. "You rode 2 miles to help a man who's been trying to squeeze you out of your land," Magnus said. Not accusing, trying to understand. "I rode 2 miles because horses were burning," Rowan said. Celeste made a small sound. Not quite a laugh, something more involuntary. Magnus looked at his daughter, then back at Rowan. Something that had been stiff and fortified in his bearing settled slightly, the way a held posture settles when a man stops needing to hold it. "Get your horse," Magnus said. "I'll have someone ride with you back to your property." "I can find my own way." "I know you can." Magnus looked at him steadily. "I'll have someone ride with you anyway." It wasn't generosity, exactly. It was something more specific. An acknowledgement, maybe, that things were different now than they'd been 4 hours ago, and that the difference needed some external expression, even if neither of them was ready to name it fully yet. Rowan stood carefully. His legs were fine now. It had been shock before, the body reallocating itself after too much demand. He found Duff where he'd left him, tied to the fence post outside the gate. He mounted, and his shoulder sent a message he made a note of and set aside. The Ashcroft rider assigned to accompany him was a compact man named Vetch, who rode without commentary and kept an even pace. They went back down the north road toward Red Mesa Valley in the early evening, and Rowan could see the stars beginning to appear over the east ridge, and could feel the night cooling around the burns on his face and hands. He didn't talk on the ride. Vetch didn't seem to require it. At his gate, Vetch pulled up. "Mr. Ashcroft said to tell you a doctor can be brought out from Harlan tomorrow morning if you need one. Tell him I appreciate the offer." "He'll want to know yes or no." Rowan looked at his hands in the last light. The burns were real, but they weren't deep. He'd worked through worse. "No," he said, "but thank him." Vetch nodded and turned and rode back north without further comment. Rowan went through his gate and took care of Duff. That always came first, regardless of what condition Rowan himself was in, and then went inside and sat at the table in the single room with the lamp low and his hands on the table in front of him, looking at the burn marks across his palms and knuckles. He thought about the black stallion and the way the animal had come out of that barn like something released from a pressure it hadn't understood. He thought about Magnus Ashcroft standing in the yard with the armor missing from his voice. He thought about Celeste looking at him with the expression that had a different texture than her usual ones. Less composed, less managed, more direct. I thought about the fact that he'd ridden 2 miles toward a fire on land belonging to the man who'd been trying to take his property, and that he hadn't thought about it, hadn't weighed it, hadn't calculated what it would cost him or what it might gain him. He'd heard horses screaming and gotten on Duff and gone. That was the truth of it. There was no better or worse version. He got up after a while and checked the wells, both still running clean, and walked the south pasture fence in the dark. feeling the wire under his burned hands, and stood for a moment in the middle of the young grass that was too dark to see, but was there, was real, was holding. He went back inside and went to bed. He was asleep before he finished deciding to be. The burns on his hands were tightest in the morning. Rowan discovered this trying to work the pump handle at the east well before sunrise. The skin across his knuckles had stiffened overnight, and the first few pulls sent a specific kind of pain up his forearms that was different from the general soreness of overworked muscle. He worked through it because there was no alternative that made sense, and by the time he'd watered Duff and gotten coffee going, the hands had loosened to something manageable. He stood on the porch with the coffee and looked out at the south pasture in the early light. The green was real now. Not the tentative suggestion of the first week, but actual grass, low and young, but holding, spreading in a way that tracked with what Celeste had predicted about the rye variety she'd specified. It wouldn't support cattle this season, maybe late next season if the second growth came in strong. But it was there, which 3 months ago had seemed like a thing that might never be true about this land. He thought about what was coming and tried to think about it clearly, without the distortion that came from wanting something to be different than it was. Magnus Ashcroft had watched him bring 5 horses out of a burning barn. Magnus had filed a fraudulent boundary claim, had it dismantled by his own daughter's testimony, and had then stood in a fire-lit yard and asked Rowan why he hadn't left the horses to burn. These were not the conditions under which anything went back to how it was. Something had shifted in the ground between them, and ignoring that would be its own kind of stupidity. But shifted didn't mean resolved. Shifted meant different, which was not the same thing. He finished the coffee and went out to start the day's work, which today was resetting 4 corner posts on the north fence that had been giving him trouble since the first week. Corner posts were the load-bearing logic of a fence. Everything else derived from them. And the ones on the north line had been set by a previous owner who'd either been careless or working in bad conditions, because 2 of them were sitting at angles that transferred stress wrong and had been slowly failing since before Rowan bought the property. He was mid-work on the second post, the bad shoulder arguing steadily about the tamping bar, when he heard horses. Multiple, moving at a working pace rather than urgency. He straightened up and looked. 4 men came through the gate. He didn't recognize any of them from Harlan, which meant they weren't from the local labor pool that Ashcroft had already shut off from him. They were dressed in working clothes, practical, and each of them had tools tied to their saddles, fence tools, post mallets, a coil of heavy gauge wire on the last horse. The man in front pulled up and looked at Rowan. He had a weathered face and a direct manner. "Hale?" "Yes." "We were sent by Mr. Ashcroft." He said it without elaboration, like the information was sufficient unto itself. Rowan looked at the 4 men. He looked at their tools. He looked back at the first man. "Sent to do what?" "Whatever needs doing." The man scanned the fence line with professional eyes. "Looks like fence work's the priority." Rowan was quiet for a moment. A complicated set of things moved through him. Not quite suspicion, not quite gratitude, something that was trying to be neither because neither was quite right. Magnus Ashcroft had not sent these men as a gift. I understood that instinctively. This was something else, a gesture that existed in the space between an apology. Magnus wasn't built to make, and a respect he hadn't previously offered. Receiving it wrong in either direction would be its own problem. "Corner posts on the north line," Rowan said. "I've got the first 2 dug out. The south line needs the wire retensioned on the east third. There's salvaged lumber behind the barn that needs sorting for what's usable." The man nodded. He didn't say anything additional. He got down and signaled the others, and they spread to their tasks with the efficiency of men who knew what they were doing and didn't need supervision, which was the most useful kind. Rowan stood for a moment watching them. Then he picked up the tamping bar and went back to the corner post he'd been working. They worked through the morning without much talk, the particular productive silence of men who were all focused on the same problems and understood that conversation wasn't the point. By mid-morning, the 2 corner posts were reset and packed, and the third was dug out, and the work had the rhythm of things going the way they were supposed to go, which was a feeling Rowan had been working toward for months and was still getting used to. At midday, one of the men, young, maybe 20, with a quiet way of working that suggested he'd been told to watch and learn as much as to do, came over to where Rowan was measuring wire and said, "Mr. Ashcroft said to tell you he'd come himself this afternoon." Rowan set down the measuring line. "He say what time?" No, sir. He came at 3. He came alone, which Rowan had not expected. No riders, no visible statement of authority behind him, just Magnus Ashcroft on the black stallion. The same stallion that had come out of that burning barn at a run and had now, apparently, returned to carrying its owner without visible resentment about the experience. Rowan thought horses were more practical about catastrophe than people generally gave them credit for. Magnus came through the gate and looked at the 4 men working the fence and the lumber pile that was half sorted now, and the south pasture, with its grass in the afternoon light. He looked at all of it with the specific attention of a man who was accounting for things, making a tally in his head, not approving or disapproving, just adding it up. He got down and tied the stallion and walked to where Rowan was. "Hands," Magnus said. Not a question, more of a check. He looked at Rowan's hands briefly, registering the status. "Fine," Rowan said. Magnus nodded once, accepting that. He looked out at the pasture. "The rye's holding. Better than I expected." "What variety?" Celeste recommended a high drought strain from the Colville seed house. Something moved across Magnus's face at the mention of her name. Not anger. Something more worn than anger. "She knows the valley better than anyone, he said. "Better than me, and I've been here 30 years. Rowan didn't say anything. He waited. Magnus walked to the fence line and put a hand on one of the newly set corner posts, testing it the way a man tested things when the testing was partly the point. Solid. He moved his hand. "I'm going to say something, Hale, and I need to say it without it becoming a conversation immediately. Can you do that?" "Yes." Magnus looked out at the valley, at the long slope of it, the creek line, the ridges on both sides. "I've been in this valley 30 years. I came here with my wife when there was nothing here but scrub and bad water and one other ranching family who sold out to me inside of 5 years. I built what's here. Not alone. I had hands, I had capital from my wife's family, but I built the shape of it. The decisions were mine." He paused. "When my wife died, I kept building because it was the only thing I understood how to do that produced something I could see." He was quiet for a moment. "The other parcels in this valley, the ones that failed, the ones I made harder to sustain, I told myself it was about consolidation, about efficiency, about building something that would outlast me." He looked at Rowan. "Some of that was true. Not all of it." "What was the rest?" Rowan said. "Control," Magnus said, without any decoration on it. "When you can't control what matters, you control what you can. Land is something you can control. Or you believe you can." Rowan looked at him. "That's an honest thing to say?" "It's an overdue thing to say." Magnus's jaw worked once. "I watched you go into that barn. I was standing 40 feet back because the heat was... I couldn't get closer. I tried. I got 40 feet and couldn't go further." He looked at his own hands for a moment. "You went past 40 feet. You went all the way in, 5 times." "I wasn't counting." "I was," Magnus said. "I counted every horse you brought out." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife would have gone in too, if she'd been there. If she'd been here in any part of the last 14 years, there are a lot of things that might have gone differently." He said it plainly, without asking for anything in response to it. Rowan let the silence sit where it was. "The boundary claim," Magnus said. "I'm withdrawing it. Formally, through Good's office. Today." "All right. That's all you've got? What else should I have?" Magnus looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression that might have been, in a man with a different construction, something like reluctant humor. "Most people would say thank you, or they'd tell me it's about time, or they'd use the moment for something." "I know you're withdrawing it," Rowan said. "Good's filing would have stopped it anyway. You're withdrawing it because you want to, not because I need you to." Magnus held his gaze. "Yes," he said. "That's right." "Then I don't need to thank you for it, and you don't need anything from me in return. It just happens." Magnus was quiet. He turned back to the valley view. "She said you were different from what I was imagining," he said. "She said that directly, which is how she says things she means." "When did she say it?" 2 nights ago, after the fire. We had a conversation that..." He stopped. "Celeste and I have hard conversations. We've been having them since she was old enough to have them. This one was harder than most." His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that took maintenance. "She told me she'd been coming here since your first week. Told me about the seed list, the driller, the county records, all of it. She didn't justify any of it. She just told me as a statement of what happened. Rowan said nothing. I asked her why, Magnus said. She told me she was tired of watching good land fail because of who was standing in its way. He looked at Rowan. She also told me she came back because of you specifically, not just the land. Rowan looked at the pasture, at the grass moving in the afternoon wind. He was careful with his expression. I'm not going to stand in the way of that, Magnus said. I'm going to tell you directly, as I tell you everything, that she is the most important thing in my life. And if you're careless with her, I will not be reasonable about it. I understand that. I don't mean financially or legally, Magnus said. I mean personally. I understand that too, Rowan said. He met Magnus's eyes. I haven't made any. I don't know what she thinks yet. About me specifically. I do, Magnus said, and didn't elaborate. They stood for a moment in a quiet that was different from the earlier quiets between them. Something had reorganized. Not resolved. Reorganized, which was more honest about what it actually was. I want to see the second well, Magnus said. They walked the north boundary together, Magnus looking at everything with those accountant's eyes. And Rowan walked without narrating anything. Magnus would ask questions if he had them, and he did, specific ones, about depth, about casing materials, about the flow rate in the dry months. He'd clearly been in enough conversations about wells to know which questions mattered. At the north well, Magnus crouched down and worked the pump handle himself. The water came up clear and cold. He put his hand in the stream for a moment, feeling the temperature. This is better than 3 of my own wells, he said. Emery cited it, Rowan said. Walt Emery. Yes. Magnus stood. She called in that favor. Yes. Magnus looked at the well. She's been collecting those for a while, he said. I never understood why. I told her it looked like she was building an operation of obligation. He paused. I think she was building an insurance policy against my worst instincts. He said it with a particular flatness that was its own kind of self-knowledge, and Rowan didn't try to soften it or redirect it. They walked back toward the gate, past the 4 men who had finished the corner posts and moved to the wire tension work on the south fence. Magnus looked at them. They'll come back Thursday, he said. I want to lend you a third hand through the end of season. A man named Pruitt who knows cattle. When you're ready to bring stock in, he can help you select the right foundation animals. Rowan stopped walking. That's a significant offer. It's a practical one, Magnus said. This valley runs better if every ranch in it is operating at capacity. I spent 12 years trying to be the only ranch in the valley. It didn't work as well as I told myself it did. He looked at Rowan steadily. Besides, I'm not giving you the man. I'm lending him. He works for me, and he'll tell me everything he sees. I'd expect that, Rowan said. Magnus almost smiled. Not quite. You're hard to be generous to. I'm not trying to be hard, Rowan said. I just know what things are. Magnus looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light came down on the valley in the specific warm way it had, the way that had surprised Rowan his first morning and still surprised him sometimes. Magnus looked out at it too, and Rowan had the sense that they were seeing the same thing but through entirely different histories, and that was all right. Thursday, Magnus said. He remounted the black stallion and rode out. Rowan watched him go. Then he looked at his 4 workers, who had asked no questions and passed no judgments on anything they'd witnessed. You want to finish that south wire today, or come back to it? He said. The lead man looked at the remaining section. Hour's work, he said. We can finish. Finish it, Rowan said, and went to help. Celeste came the following morning. She came differently than she usually did. Not the working arrival, the canvas satchel, and the business of the land manner. She came slower, and she came to the porch rather than riding the fence line, and she got down from the gray mare and stood in the yard and looked at Rowan with an expression that was open in a way her expressions generally weren't. He told me he came, she said, yesterday afternoon. He said you talked for a while. We did. She looked at the fence line, at the straight, solid corner posts. He sent men. They finished the south wire last night. They're coming back Thursday. She nodded slowly. She was doing the accounting that she always did, the tallying of what had changed and what it meant. He'd learned to recognize it, the slight stillness, the eyes that were looking at what was in front of her, but thinking about something related to it. He's not a man who does this kind of thing, she said. Sending men, offering Pruitt, coming here himself without riders. She looked at Rowan. You understand that? I understand it's significant. It's more than significant. She paused. It's the closest he knows how to come to saying he was wrong. I know. She looked at him for a moment. The morning was cool, the kind of cool that came before a warm day and was already pulling back from the ridges. He told me about your conversation. Not all of it. The parts he chose to tell me. She stopped. He told me he said something about me. About what I'd told him. Rowan waited. He told me he told you that I came back because of you specifically, she said. Not just the land. He did say that. She looked at him with a directness that was one of the constants of her, regardless of what else was variable. That was his interpretation, she said. I want you to know what mine is. All right. She came up the porch step and stood close enough that he had to look at her at a different angle than usual. Her eyes were the kind of dark that looked black in low light and brown in full sun, and right now in the morning they were somewhere between. I came back the second time because the land needed someone who understood it, she said. That part was true and it was real. I'm not going to pretend it was entirely personal. She paused. I came back every time after that because of you. Rowan held her gaze. You're telling me this directly. I do everything directly. You've had long enough to know that. I know it, he said. He looked at her, at the steady set of her, the way she stood when she'd made a decision and was through debating it with herself. I don't know what to offer you that's proportionate to what you've given this place. I don't want something proportionate, she said. I'm not keeping accounts with you. That's different from everything else about you. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but in the same territory. Yes, she said. It is. He reached out and put his hand, the burned one, the one that was still stiff in the mornings, over hers where it rested on the porch rail. She looked down at it, at the marks across the knuckles. She turned her hand over and held his. They stood like that for a moment without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. Thursday, she said eventually. When Pruitt comes. I want to be here for that conversation. I know which foundation cattle make sense for this land, and Pruitt has opinions that don't always account for soil type. I assumed you'd be here, Rowan said. Good, she said. She didn't move her hand. The week that followed had a different quality from the weeks before it. Not easier. The work was the same work. The shoulder still had its opinions. The land still asked everything you had and then asked for more. But different in the way that a thing you've been pushing against alone and then have help with is different. Not lighter, exactly, just differently weighted. Pruitt arrived Thursday as promised. He was a compact, blunt-spoken man in his 50s who looked at the south pasture with the experienced eye of a man who'd made his livings on cattle ground for 30 years and said, "You'll be ready for stock late next season if you manage the grazing rotation right." I know the rotation, Rowan said. Pruitt looked at him. Ashcroft said you would. He didn't look entirely comfortable saying it, like the words implied something about his employer he wasn't used to hearing out loud. Celeste was there, as she'd said she would be, and she and Pruitt went around the north pasture together for an hour, with the particular friction of two people who knew their subject and didn't fully trust each other's application of it. It produced useful argument. By the end they'd agreed on a foundation herd target of 40 head to start, smaller than Rowan had hoped, but realistic for the current pasture capacity, and 3 specific bloodlines that were suited to Red Mesa Valley's elevation and temperature swings. Pruitt told Rowan he'd be back in 2 weeks, looked at the wells with an approving expression he didn't verbalize, and rode back north. He'll tell your father everything, Rowan said. Yes, Celeste said. That's why I said what I said about the bloodlines in front of him. My father needs to hear it from someone he trusts. Rowan looked at her. You're managing your father through his own ranch hand. I've been managing my father through various channels for 15 years, she said, without particular pride or apology. It's an imperfect system. It's the system available. He thought about Magnus Ashcroft, who had stood in the yard of a burning barn and counted horses and then come to this property alone and said things about control and grief that had cost him something to say. He thought about the man Celeste had described over a lunch counter in Mill Haven, who expanded after loss, who measured things by what they produced, who was trying, in his particular and imperfect way, to do something different. "He's going to be all right," Rowan said. Celeste looked at him. "You don't know him well enough to say that." "I know what he looked like in that yard," Rowan said, "after the stallion came out." She was quiet for a moment. "What did he look like?" Rowan thought about the armor that had been missing from Magnus's bearing, the jaw that had worked once, the eyes that were doing something complicated. Like a man who'd just found out that something he thought he understood was actually different from what he thought, he said. "That's a hard thing to feel, but it's not a bad thing." Celeste looked at the pasture for a long time. "My mother used to say he had more feeling in him than he knew what to do with," she said. "She said the ranch was where he put it because he didn't have anywhere else." She paused. "I used to think that was sad. Now I think it was just true." The afternoon was going long and warm, the light doing what it did in this valley at the end of the day, and they were standing at the fence they'd first worked together, the north line with its new corner post solid in the ground, and the work of the day was finished around them. "Stay for supper," Rowan said. "It came out plainly, no performance in it." She looked at him. "What are you making?" "Whatever's in the larder." "That's not an answer." "Salt pork and whatever's with it." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." They went inside. The single room was what it was. Sparse, functional, the table where the deed still sat in its spot at the edge, because Rowan hadn't found a better place for it. Celeste looked at the deed for a moment, at the table, at the room, without commentary. She sat down and pushed her sleeves up and asked where he kept the flour because cornbread needed something to go with the salt pork. He told her. She found it. She started working. He watched her for a moment, the ease of it, the complete absence of any self-consciousness about being in his kitchen, doing a practical thing. And then he went to the fire and got the pan going, and they worked in the particular coordinated quiet of two people who had been solving problems side by side long enough that they didn't need to negotiate the space. Outside, the valley settled into evening. The wells ran. The grass stood in the south pasture. The deed on the corner of the table had no dispute on it anymore. Rowan would deal with the formal withdrawal in the morning. Tonight the land was simply his, and the woman at his kitchen table was simply here, and that was enough to work with. He put the salt pork in the pan and listened to the sound of the fire, and Celeste moving behind him, and didn't try to make it into anything larger than it was, because what it actually was seemed like plenty. The formal withdrawal arrived at Good's office on a Monday morning, 11 days after the fire. Rowan was at the north fence when Good rode out personally to deliver the news, which was unusual enough that Rowan set down his tools and waited. Good was not a man who made unnecessary trips. He handed Rowan the county confirmation, a single page, stamped and dated, and said, "It's done. The boundary claim is formally withdrawn, and the assessor's meeting has been canceled. Your deed stands uncontested." Rowan looked at the paper. The language was legal and dry, and said in official terms what he already knew was true, but seeing it on paper with the county stamp on it was different from knowing it. It was the difference between a thing being real and a thing being documented, and in his experience, the documented version was the one that held when everything else tried to move. "Thank you," Rowan said. He meant it for Good's office, for the trip, for the months of navigation through something that should never have been complicated in the first place. Good nodded. He looked out at the south pasture, at the grass that was now properly established, no longer tentative, thick enough to have genuine color in the morning light. "Progress," he said, more to himself than to Rowan. "Slowly," Rowan said. "That's the only kind that holds," Good said, and rode back to Harlan. Rowan folded the confirmation and put it with the deed, which now had a small stack of documents beside it on the table. The certified survey copy, Celeste's written statement, the county confirmation. The accumulation of a fight that was over. He'd keep them all. A man who'd come through something like that needed the paper record. The same way a healed bone was still the bone that had broken. The history was in the structure, whether you could see it or not. The first cattle came in 3 weeks later. Pruitt had found them through a rancher named Alderman who ran stock 2 counties east and was willing to sell a foundation group at a fair price. 38 head of mixed breeding, solid animals that had been properly maintained, including 6 heifers that Celeste had approved on the basis of specific characteristics Rowan could follow but couldn't yet fully evaluate on his own. That was honest. He knew cattle generally. He knew this valley's cattle specifically less well than she did, and pretending otherwise would have been the kind of pride that cost money. The day the cattle came in, Celeste was there before the herd arrived. She was at the gate when the drive came down the north road, and she stood beside Rowan and watched each animal come through with the focused attention of someone making continuous assessments. She said very little during the actual entry, just occasional murmurs, a head shake at one animal that turned out to have a bad rear leg that Alderman's man had hoped they wouldn't notice, a nod at the 6 heifers. Rowan sent the animal with the bad leg back. Alderman's man argued. Rowan said nothing and held the gate until the argument was finished and the animal went back the way it came. "He'll complain to Alderman," Celeste said after the man rode off. "Let him," Rowan said. "I'm not paying for a lame animal." She looked at him. "No," she said. "You're not." 37 head settled into the south pasture by afternoon, and Rowan walked the fence line that evening, checking every post and wire, while the cattle moved across the grass he'd planted and tended and watered through a season that had cost him nearly everything he had. He walked slowly. He wasn't in a hurry. The animals moved the way healthy cattle moved. Not dramatically, just steadily, heads down, finding the best grass, establishing the quiet patterns of a herd, getting comfortable with new ground. It was not a triumphant moment. He'd half expected it to feel like one, and it didn't, which he thought was probably the right outcome. Triumph was for things that were finished. This was a beginning, which had its own specific feeling, less elevated than triumph, more durable. The feeling of a foundation being real. He finished the fence walk and stood at the south corner post, the one he'd reset in that first brutal week, the one that had given him the most trouble, and put his hand on it, solid, going nowhere. He went in and made dinner and didn't make it into anything larger than it was. Magnus came to the ranch on a Saturday, 2 weeks after the cattle arrived. He came the same way he'd come before, alone, on the black stallion, through the gate without announcement. But everything else about his arrival was different from the early visits. He didn't ride in with 4 men behind him and stand over Rowan with the deed in the mud. He came in at a walk and got down and tied his horse and came to where Rowan was working the water trough near the south pasture fence. He stood at the fence and looked at the cattle for a long time without speaking. Rowan kept working the trough fitting that had been dripping since Wednesday. "I wasn't going to stop working because Magnus Ashcroft was looking at his land." That time was past. 37, Magnus said finally. "1 went back. Bad leg." "Whose were they?" "Alderman's." Magnus made a sound. "Alderman runs decent stock. You should be able to build from that base." He watched a heifer move across the far end of the pasture. "The heifers are good. Celeste picked them." "I know," Magnus said. "She told me what she was looking for." He paused. "She's been spending more time here than at home." Rowan set down the wrench and looked at him. "She's been helping manage the herd transition," he said. "She knows the land and the cattle better than I do in specifics. That's useful." "That's not all it is," Magnus said. "No," Rowan said. "It's not." Magnus looked at him with an expression that was direct and not entirely comfortable with what it was doing. "When I was 29, he said, I met a woman who knew more about ranching than I did and wasn't shy about it. I spent 4 months being proud before I admitted it was a quality rather than a problem." He paused. "I'm telling you that so you don't spend 4 months being proud." Rowan looked at him. "I haven't been." "Good." Magnus looked back at the cattle. "She's going to want to be involved in every decision about this operation. Soil, water, cattle selection, rotation schedule, all of it. That's not going to change." "I know." "Does it bother you?" Rowan thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes I'd like to figure something out on my own before she figures it out," he said. "But that's my problem, not hers." Magnus looked at him sharply. Then his expression shifted. Something that in a different man with a different face would have been a smile. On Magnus, it was more like the precondition for one. "That's the right answer," he said. "That's exactly the right answer, and it took me about 4 years to arrive at it with her mother." They were quiet for a moment. The cattle moved. The water trough dripped at a slower rate now that the fitting was better seated. "I've been thinking about what this valley could do," Magnus said. "If the ranches in it were cooperating instead of competing." He looked at Rowan sideways. "Hendricks runs good fencing stock, but his water situation is worse than yours was. There's a man named Cole who came in 2 years ago on the western parcel, and he knows horses but not cattle. If those operations were connected, shared water access, coordinated drives, a combined weight at market, the economics change substantially. Rowan looked at him. You're talking about a valley cooperative. I'm talking about something that makes practical sense, Magnus said. Call it what you want. Celeste talked about this, Rowan said. Not in those words, but the shape of it. She gets things from her mother, Magnus said, and his voice went somewhere briefly that he didn't follow. I want to hold a meeting at my place, Ashcroft Ranch. Hendricks, Cole, you, anyone else with land in this valley. Talk through what a shared arrangement would look like. He looked at Rowan steadily. I need you there. Not as a courtesy, because nobody in that room is going to believe I've changed direction if the man I spent 4 months trying to push out isn't sitting at the table. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the first day Magnus had come here, the deed in the mud, the 4 riders, the end-of-month deadline. He thought about the yard of the burning barn, the armor missing from the man's bearing. He thought about what Celeste had said, the closest he knows how to come to saying he was wrong. When? Rowan said. 2 weeks, Saturday. I'll be there, Magnus nodded. He looked once more at the cattle, at the south pasture, at the 2 well casings visible from where they stood. Then he mounted the black stallion and rode out the way he'd come, at a walk, unhurried. Rowan picked up the wrench and finished the trough fitting. Celeste arrived an hour later and found him where he usually was, which was working on whatever currently needed working on. She got down and stood at the south fence and looked at the cattle. He came, she said. He told you he was coming? He told me he'd been thinking about the Valley Cooperative idea. That's the same as telling me. She watched the herd for a moment. He asked you to the meeting. Yes. Are you going? Yes. She turned from the fence and looked at him with the direct look that was one of the fixed features of her. He's trying, she said. He's not good at it. He does it the way he does everything, by deciding it's the practical choice rather than admitting it's the right one. But he's trying. I know, Rowan said. I'm not holding the past against him. I am, she said plainly. Some of it. I think you should too. Not as a way of punishing him, but as a way of being honest about what happened. She paused. The men he cut off from you. Craddock, Birch, all of them. They were following his lead, but he set the lead. That doesn't disappear because he sent 4 workers and made an offer about Pruitt. Rowan looked at her. She was right, and she was also something more than right. She was being honest about her father in a way that wasn't easy and wasn't performing difficulty. She just said true things, including the ones that were complicated to say. I know it doesn't disappear, Rowan said, but it changes shape. That's enough for now. She thought about that. Yes, she said. That's fair? They walked the north fence together that afternoon, the full line all the way to the east corner and back, and talked about the cattle and the rotation schedule and what the second season's grass would look like if the winter was mild. They talked about the cooperative meeting and who else in the valley had operations worth bringing in. They talked about Cole on the western parcel, who Celeste had met once and found competent but isolated, the kind of man who'd been managing alone so long he'd forgotten the value of adjacent operations. They did not talk about what they were to each other, because there was nothing left to establish that hadn't already been established by 6 months of walking fence lines together and going to county seats together and sitting at the same kitchen table. Some things built themselves in the building of other things, and trying to name them mid-construction was less useful than letting the construction finish. Rowan understood this imperfectly. He was a man who liked to know what the stakes were and what he was working toward. Ambiguity about practical things made him uncomfortable. Ambiguity about this particular thing made him uncomfortable in a different way, less like a problem and more like a thing he was being patient with, which was not a mode that came to him easily, but that he was learning. The Saturday meeting at the Ashcroft Ranch was the first time Rowan had been on that property in full daylight without a crisis attached to it. The rebuilt barn was still raw lumber. They'd gone fast on the structure because it was needed, and the new wood stood out against the older weathered buildings the way a healed scar stood out against surrounding skin. Visible. Part of the landscape now, but differently colored. Hendricks was there when Rowan arrived, standing near the hitching post with the settled posture of a man who'd decided to come and wasn't going to second-guess it. He nodded at Rowan in the way of people who'd exchanged a significant favor and didn't need to discuss it. Cole was younger than Rowan had expected, 35 maybe, with an earnest manner that suggested he'd been serious about ranching since before he was ready for it. He looked at Rowan with recognition, which meant he'd heard the story. Most people in the valley had heard the story by now, or some version of it. Rowan had stopped thinking about what version they'd heard and started thinking about what was actually true, which was a more manageable project. Magnus ran the meeting the way he ran everything, directly, without prologue, with the specific efficiency of a man who believed that preparation was something you did before the meeting, not during it. He laid out the cooperative structure in terms that were clear and practical. Shared water access agreements, coordinated seasonal drives that would reduce individual costs, a combined market weight that would give all of them better leverage with buyers. No sentimentality about it, no narrative about changed hearts and new beginnings. Just the mechanics of a thing that made sense. Celeste sat to Rowan's left and said very little during the formal presentation, which meant she and Magnus had already worked through the substance of it, and she'd made her contributions before the room filled. Rowan had come to understand that this was how they operated, not in opposition to each other, but in a kind of alternating current that had developed over a lifetime of being two strong people in the same family. The discussion that followed the presentation was the messy part. Hendricks had questions about the water access agreements that took 40 minutes to work through because the specifics mattered, and nobody wanted to rush them. Cole had concerns about the coordinated drive schedule that conflicted with his horse operations peak season. Rowan had one specific concern about the market weight arrangement, who held the contracts and whose name they were under, and he raised it directly, which produced a silence in the room that had a particular quality. Magnus looked at him. "You want the contracts held by the cooperative, not by my operation." "Yes," Rowan said. "That's a structural change from what I proposed." "I know." Magnus was quiet for a moment. Hendricks was watching carefully, which Rowan was aware of. Cole was looking at the table. "You're right," Magnus said. It came out without visible effort, which meant he'd already thought about it and had been waiting to see if someone would catch it. "The contracts should be held by the cooperative entity. I'll have good draft it that way." Hendricks let out a breath. Not relieved exactly, more like a man who'd been watching to see how something would go and had gotten the answer. They came to terms by mid-afternoon. Not perfect terms. There were things that would need revisiting as the arrangement developed, conditions that would prove wrong or insufficient once the reality of operation pushed against them. But honest terms, documented, with each party's name on the same page. On the ride back to Red Mesa Valley, Celeste rode beside Rowan on the gray mare, and they didn't talk for the first mile. The late afternoon was doing its thing with the light, the valley going gold and long-shadowed, and the air was cool enough to be comfortable. "The contract point," she said eventually. "It needed to be said." He'd already thought of it. He was testing whether anyone else in the room would catch it. "I know," Rowan said. She looked at him sideways. "Did you know that before you said it, or after?" "Before," he said. "Didn't change whether I needed to say it." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It didn't." They rode in comfortable silence for another mile. Duff moved at his reliable pace, 13 years old and still steady, which Rowan thought was something worth noting. The things that held weren't always the young and impressive ones. Sometimes they were just the ones that had been doing the job long enough to know how. "I want to show you something," Celeste said. She turned the gray mare off the main road onto a track that led up the east ridge, and Rowan followed. They climbed for about 20 minutes, the horses picking their way up the track that was real but narrow, and came out on a bench of land near the ridgeline that looked out over the whole of Red Mesa Valley. Rowan pulled Duff up and looked. He'd never seen it from this angle. From ground level, the valley was a series of adjacent problems. This fence, that pasture, this well, that soil composition. From here it was a shape, a whole thing, and the shape was different from what he'd been building in his head from the inside. The Ashcroft home ranch was visible to the north, the cluster of buildings and the corrals and the new raw barn. His own property was to the south. Smaller, obviously, the two wells visible if you knew where to look. The south pasture, a different color from the surrounding land because the ryegrass was a different green than the native growth. The creek ran between them, catching the light. The Hendricks property was west, the Cole parcel further west. She used to bring me up here, Celeste said. My mother. When I was young. She said you couldn't understand a thing until you could see its whole shape. Rowan looked at the valley, at the south pasture, which from here was clearly working land, holding its green against the surrounding pale. At the two well casings he could just barely distinguish, at the fence lines running straight. It's not what it was, he said. He meant when he'd bought it, when it was a ruin. No, she said. It's not. He thought about the 11 minutes at the auction, the $14, the night he'd slept on a porch with his hat over his face and run numbers until 3 in the morning, the well coming in at 6 feet, water rising around his boots in the hole he'd dug on the word of a woman he'd met once, the boundary filing, the county seat, the certified copy with its dry official language, the fire, the smoke, the stallion going out those doors. He thought about Magnus in a firelit yard with the armor missing from his voice. He thought about Celeste at a lunch counter eating beans with her sleeves pushed up, telling him about her mother with no performance in it. He thought about the first fence section they'd repaired together, when she hadn't offered to help, and he hadn't asked, and they'd arrived at the same spot on the same problem from different directions, and it had worked. None of it had been smooth, none of it had arrived in a shape that was convenient or tidy. The shoulder still had its opinions on cold mornings. There were 37 cattle in the south pasture that needed careful management through an uncertain first winter. The cooperative was a framework, not a result. The result was still being built, and would take years. And Magnus Ashcroft was not a changed man. He was a man who had made a specific adjustment because the evidence had demanded it, and because he was, underneath the control and the expansion and the grief he'd built an empire around, practical enough to update when he had to. That wasn't the same as changed. It was a start, and a start was what you could honestly call it, and nothing more. But the valley was different from what it had been, not because of any one thing, not because of the wells or the grass or the fire or the meeting today with its cooperative agreement and its shared contract structure. Because of all of it together, accumulated over months, each piece dependent on the piece before it. What do you want? Celeste said. She was looking at the valley too. It was the same question she'd asked him, essentially, the very first day, riding onto his land before he'd earned anything on it, asking why he'd bought it. She was asking it again now, but it was a different question. It had a different weight, and it was pointing at a different territory. He thought about the honest answer. To finish what I started, he said. The cattle operation. The third well Emery said was possible on the south boundary, getting the north pasture to the same condition as the south. He paused. To do it right. Not fast. Right. She looked at him. And I want you here, he said. Not as a consultant. Not as someone who helps with the parts I don't know yet, and then rides back to her father's ranch. Here. She was quiet for a moment. The valley was very still in the late light. That's a significant thing to want, she said. I know what I'm asking. My father will have opinions. Your father already told me, Rowan said. He said if I was careless with you, he wouldn't be reasonable about it. Something shifted in her expression. He said that. Directly. She looked back at the valley for a moment. A long moment, the kind that had actual thinking in it rather than dramatic pause. I'm not easy, she said. I want to be clear about that before you decide you've asked. I know you're not easy. I'll have positions about everything. The cattle, the water, the cooperative arrangement, how you spend money and when. I know. That won't change, she said. I don't become less opinionated because of... She gestured at the space between them, at whatever the space between them now was. Any of this. Celeste, he said. I know. She looked at him. You say that like you mean it. I say it like a man who's been working next to you for 6 months and has had no illusions about your opinions for approximately 5 months and 3 weeks of that. She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed. A real one, short and genuine, the kind that didn't have any management in it. He hadn't heard her laugh like that before. He thought he'd like to hear it again. All right, she said. She said it the way she said things she meant, without decoration. They rode back down the ridge as the sun finished setting, and the valley was in its last light when they came through Rowan's gate. He took care of Duff, and she took care of the gray mare, and they were standing in the yard when they heard the approach of a horse from the north road. It was Vetch, Magnus's compact, quiet rider. He pulled up at the gate and handed Rowan an envelope without dismounting. Rowan opened it. A single page, Magnus's large, controlled handwriting. It said, "Good will have the cooperative paperwork ready by end of week. I've also spoken to Alderman directly. He'll stand behind his stock on the second group. You'll have first pick of next spring's heifers at fair price. Regarding the other matter, she has her mother's judgment about people. I've learned to trust it, even when it's inconvenient for me. That's all I'll say about it." Rowan read it twice, folded it, put it in his pocket. "What does it say?" Celeste asked. "Cooperative paperwork by end of week. First pick of Alderman's spring heifers." "And?" He looked at her. "He says you have your mother's judgment about people." She was still for a moment. Something moved across her face that was private and real. She looked away at the south pasture, at the cattle settling for the evening, at the dark shape of the two well casings in the last light. "He never says things like that," she said. "No," Rowan said. "I don't think he does." She was quiet for a long moment. The evening settled around them. The cattle in the south pasture made their sounds. Somewhere on the east ridge, a bird was doing something with the last of the light. The wells ran steady and clean. There is a thing that happens to land when someone decides to fight for it. Not with weapons, not with drama, but with the slow and ordinary commitment of showing up every morning and doing the next necessary thing. The land doesn't respond immediately. It doesn't respond gratefully. It responds the way things respond to sustained attention over time, which is to say it starts to reflect back what's been put into it. Rowan Hale had come to Red Mesa Valley with $14 and a deed that everyone told him was a document for a lost cause. He'd come without connection, without resources, without anyone who owed him anything. He'd come with the only things he actually had: the ability to read land honestly, the stubbornness to keep going when the route forward wasn't clear, and the particular kind of self-knowledge that came from having very little and knowing exactly what it was worth. What he'd built was not a triumph. It was a working ranch on ground that had been abandoned and fought over and falsely claimed and left for dead. It was 37 head of cattle and 2 working wells, and a south pasture holding its green into its second season. It was a cooperative agreement signed by 3 ranchers and 1 man who'd previously been his enemy, with contracts held by the group rather than the most powerful member. It was Celeste Ashcroft standing in his yard in the evening, looking at what they'd made together, with the expression of a person who'd found the right problem to spend herself on. None of that was clean or simple. The cooperative would have friction. The cattle would have losses in a hard winter. The shoulder would be a problem until it wasn't, and then something else would be a problem instead. Magnus Ashcroft was not a transformed man. He was a man with a specific, limited capacity for adjustment who had found that capacity and used it, which was more than most people managed and less than the version of the story where everything resolved into warmth and ease. But here was what Rowan had come to understand, in the way you understood things that came from experience rather than being told. The value of something was not in its condition when you found it. The land had been worthless to every person who'd looked at it and weighed it against what it would cost them. It had not been worthless. It had been unworked. Those were different things, and the difference was everything. People were the same way. Not all of them. Some things were genuinely past their use, and the honest thing was to recognize it. But some things that looked like loss were just potential that hadn't found the right application yet. A man with nothing but stubbornness and a clear eye. A woman who'd been collecting knowledge and favors for 15 years and waiting for a reason to deploy them. A father who understood control better than grace but was capable, in the specific conditions of a burning barn and a daughter's testimony, of something like an honest reckoning. None of them were what they'd been 6 months ago. Not transformed, not perfected, just moved. Moved by what had happened between them, what they'd asked of each other and what they'd received. "Come inside," Rowan said. "It's getting cold." Celeste looked at the south pasture one more time, at the cattle and the grass and the fence line running straight. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, without making it into anything larger than what it was. They went inside, and the door closed against the evening air, and the fire was there to be built up, and the valley outside held everything they'd made in it, imperfect, hard-won, alive, and entirely real.